Hi, I'm Roy Thomas, and you're watching Still Only 35 Cents.
I'm pleased to share this very special edition of the Bullpen Interviews, a conversation with the legendary Roy Thomas. Roy Thomas was a prolific writer within the industry, and perhaps most notably was editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics from 1972 through to 1974, and the first to succeed Stan Lee. Roy is credited with co-creating a number of classic characters in the Marvel Universe, including Ghost Rider, Wolverine, Vision, Carol Danvers Ms Marvel, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Ultron, Yellowjacket, The Defenders, Man-Thing, Red Sonja, Morbius, the Squadron Supreme, the Invaders, Doc Samson, Dane Whitman's Black Knight, as well as X-Men's Havok, Banshee and Sunfire, amongst others. He was also best known for introducing the pulp magazine hero Conan the Barbarian to American comics. I recently got the chance to chat with him at Supernova Brisbane, and we were able to discuss his early career and his time in the early Bronze Age at Marvel. So without further ado, let's jump into the chat with Roy.
Yeah, okay.
Well, good. No, great to meet you, Roy. Thank you so much for...
I'm sorry I'm a little jet lagged, but I'm doing the best I can.
When did you get here?
We got here yesterday early afternoon, and I immediately crashed and went back to sleep again. I slept some hours on the trip over. So by about 11 or so last night, I woke up, and since that time, maybe a few minutes here and there, but mostly I've been awake since then. I couldn't get back to sleep anymore. I guess I've had enough sleep. So but I'll be okay. I'm a little groggy, but people understand that. You travel all the way from the other side of the world, and you're pushing 84 years old.
I was going to mention, I was looking through when I was doing the research in terms of how long you've been in the industry.
Next year it'll be 60 years. Wow. I mean, I'm not doing a lot of writing now. I do an occasional story. I've got one story Marvel hasn't published yet. I'm working on I have to do the dialogue in a couple of weeks for a 50-page or 48-page Conan story for the new publisher that I plotted. It's mostly original story. And, I'm working on my autobiography and my magazine, all through the history comics, and 3 online strips about Tarzan and other Burroughs characters, and a few other projects here and there. That kind of keeps me busy. Especially I've been retired for 20 years.
That was my next question. As retirement seems to be suiting you.
I took early retirement at the age of 62, and it didn't quite work. I worked, as much as I ever did, but you make more money when you're doing, like the comics and the movies stuff I was doing. But I'm still doing all right. And Marvel's republishing so much and using characters that either characters or concepts that I, along with other people, developed in the movies, and they send a little money along for that. It adds up. So I'm living well.
That's good.
Better not call the poor boy from Missouri was ever going to do when I was 24 years old.
Well, that's actually where I was going to start the interview. When I was reviewing through it, I wanted to get a sense, because a lot of the work seems to be stems a lot from classic literature in terms of like your inspiration, like how you got into the industry, especially if you think about Conan, for instance, right? Like, how did that? It's an interesting one for me, just seeing how you evolved over the years in terms of like starting as a writer and then moved to become editor-in-chief. Like, how did you find that from an early age in terms of getting into the industry?
Well, I mean, obviously, and I think this is true probably for you, many people in their career, you're probably, if you end up with a real career, or maybe 2 or 3, 4 careers over your life, the chances are you were preparing for them a long time before you knew you were. In my case, probably ever since the age of 4, when I, saw my first comic book and got my mother to buy one for me, which means it was 20 years before I got into the field. But I didn't know it. I was just reading comic books. I was drawing or writing my own comic books. I was writing other things as well, without really much thought most of the time about ever getting into the field and so forth. But once or twice I said a thing around. But even when I did, and I was thinking about something might get published, again, it wasn't really with the idea that it would become a regular job or that would be my. I would have loved it. It just didn't occur to me that some guy living in Missouri, in the St. Louis area, in the middle of the country, was going to end up, working for these companies that were all out of New York. I had very little ambition, really. I was teaching for a few years. I didn't care that much for that, but I had no other ambition, so I just kept at it. And enjoyed myself inside by getting involved in comics fandom, which again was a partial preparation for my career, but I didn't know it. I thought I was just having fun to get away from the TV and TV because I didn't have to. Next thing you know, it turns out that my publishing and editing the magazine, Alter Ego, was one of the things that helped lead to my career because it brought me to the attention of different people. Stan Lee saw it, and work-wise, we edited the Superman comics. Saw my magazines. I sent them into all the editors of DC Comics, and he saw them, and his childhood friend, Julius Schwartz, was also editing DC. He's the one I wrote to most when he was editing Justice League, Green Lantern, The Flash, books I really like. And, somehow between Julie and Morgan, they all kind of conspired. They got me into the comics deal. And I was, at the time, I had just agreed to, and I was happy to do it, to take a fellowship to study what they call foreign relations at Washington, George Washington University, Washington, D.C. And I probably would have had to work my way through. I didn't have any money, saved or anything like that for a period of 2 years. I had a little money, but not much. And then all of a sudden I get this job offer in the mail from Mort Weisner, a trial period to be his assistant editor on the Superman comics, Superman, Jimmy Olsen, and the World's Finest. And I decided I'd rather do that than go into an academic life and become a college professor or a diplomat or something like that. Not that diplomatic thing.
Well, we wouldn't be having this interview had you done that.
Right. Diplomacy's lost, it's comic books is lost.
Yeah, but I think the other thing is the amount of characters that you've created that have entered the modern culture. That's the piece that, if you'd have taken that career back, it would have been very different. It wouldn't be.
Yeah, somebody else would have done a lot of some of the same things that have done it differently. Some of the things would have been done better. Some of the things would have been worse. The comic industry would have survived and thrived without it. Probably better than I would have without it. But at the same time, when I look back at it, even though it's not like I feel I'm not the indispensable man, say the way that people like. To some extent, Julius Schwartz, certainly Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Ditko. I'm not the indispensable guy the way that they were. But once I got into the field, I did some worthwhile work, better than the average. I'll give myself that credit, but I won't go beyond that.
The cues that I've seen today, and also in previous times when I've actually met you and seen you with other players, that should say that, it's testament to the fact that people really loved your work, really loved the stories.
Or sometimes just they might like the work that other people did with characters like co-created, like Wolverine, that I did have a hand in co-creating. Very definitely, there wouldn't be a Wolverine without me. I'm the one person on Earth without whom there would probably not be a character called Wolverine. That's not true of anybody else on Earth living with dead. However, at the same time, other people then did more work with Wolverine than I did. From Len Wein was the original writer on through, Byrne and Chris Claremont in particular. Chris Claremont, who developed Wolverine more than anybody, and probably the most important Wolverine writer, after Len and I did the character. And, like no other people did wonderful work with it. But still, people come, they want to decide because they realize that, that I had a hand in the creation of the character. I definitely did, so I signed it.
I did want to go back to what you said earlier. What was the first comic book that you bought?
I have no idea. The first comic book was actually bought for me by my parents, probably my mother. It was probably a Superman or Batman. I think those are some of the earliest ones that were available. Captain Marvel came pretty early too. But I don't know, my mother read them to me. But I was 4 years old. They were just 3, but certainly no older than 4. And we didn't have kindergarten, so I'm not going to any school. I didn't start school until I was pushing 6, 5 or 6. So but I don't know, what it was. Whether it reached it to me, but I didn't understand. There's a lot of bats in Missouri, but I didn't know what a bat was really good. So when she's reading about Batman and Robin, I thought these guys wore masks, and even then I knew the crooks wore masks. So I thought she was reading about a couple of places called Batman and Robin, and I was translating to these crooks called Batman and Robin. People all realized these were the good guys, and the same way with other characters. But pretty soon I learned to read on my own, well before first grade. And the earliest comic that I definitely remember having a copy of in 45, I would have been 4 or 5, I don't know if I was yet, was an early issue of Green Lantern. I think it was number 16 or something. And because I remember reading it in the backseat of our old car, in a diagonal parking space in front of the drugstore where it had been bought, across the street from the band shell on the yard of the county courthouse, where they had this band shell where the band would play, a weekly concert. And you can't get much more small town than a band concert in the middle of summer, which is weird because the comic seems to come out early, and then I knew I had that comic. But anyway, that's the earliest I can remember. And somewhere in there, the first All-Star comic, my first comic, favorite comic, it still is, really, for the concept of the group superheroes, which is what really made me a diamond in the real thing, was the group idea of the Justice Society of America. And from then on, I expanded out everything, the Human Torch, Submariner, never cared as much as Captain America as I did for Torch and Seven, Black Terror, all these guys, I loved them all.
Well, that's an interesting one because obviously with Invaders and the early Marvel, you're saying that Captain America wasn't your favourite.
Yeah.
When it came to
I liked it, just not as well as the others.
Not as well as the others. Because it's an interesting one when I look back at all those books, and especially the early Marvel when you first joined, obviously your original love of comics started with DC.
Yeah.
So in terms of when you made the transition to Marvel, what was the driving force like? Because I know you returned back to DC.
Well, the only driving force was not liking the editor who had hired me at DC, and he was a very sadistic guy. He treated all his assistants and artists poorly. I was just the latest in a lot. I would have probably taken it and survived. I've been a teacher, something I've never been criticized in my life, or anything like that. But I wanted to make it. It was wearing on me because it was so mean. But I would have survived that thing. But the thing is, I was already. I don't want to you didn't have the feeling that I was a DC fan and not a Marvel. By that time, I liked Marvel comics as well or better than I liked DC.
Because of the transition.
Yeah, because
there was no superheroes in it.
Because of what Stan and Jack and Steve were doing.
Yes.
And even though I liked DC's characters as well or better, but I felt that Stan was the best writer in comics. And I felt that, while I wasn't quite as big a fan of the art, it was good. You have to also Kirby and Good though. And even if they weren't yet at their very best, they were still pretty good. And so but mainly what I want to do is I want to Stan Lee. He was the person I admired the most because he was the writer. And I had the thing with Marvel, from the first issue of Fantastic Four that I saw, I admired the writing even more than the art. I admired the art. But I was writing oriented to the best. I liked the stories, and I realized that what Stan was writing was superior to what the DC guys were writing, for what I wanted to see. So I wanted to meet Stan. He didn't want to really socialize. He lived out on Long Island, and he knew who I was. But he had me take this writing test. It's hard to resist it. Just take one test, And when I met him, when I finally did meet him, I said, hey, we never discussed the test at all. I guess I passed it. As John Lennon said, I hope we passed the audition. But I was sort of the same way, but he never mentioned it. But I guess I did because 15 minutes after we met, he offered me a job. And I said, okay, just, give me the same money DC offered me, because they had decreased the amount by $10 a week after I got there. Yeah, it wasn't
classic stuff.
10%. I don't understand what happened. What was supposed to be a 2-month trial period became 2 weeks, and plus he's a sadistic bastard. So, so all of a sudden, God bless Burt Weiser. If he hadn't been a sadistic bastard, I would have never been disloyal enough, you know, to quit the guy who helped me bring me to New York to go to work for the rival. Especially, you know, smaller companies probably would have less money to throw around. So I'd have felt a loyalty to him. But he was so unpleasant that I left this company that had always been my favorite, sentimental favorite company, to go to work for a smaller company and kind of cast my fate to the winds. And I did it more from self-defense because I just didn't like the editor, but because of the love of Mormon. It worked out very well.
Yes,
but it's just dumb luck.
Yeah, serendipitous and just fantastic for, I think, for all the fans. In terms of
having talent is nice, as Stan always said, but being lucky is better.
Exactly. Yeah. So my understanding is your first gig at Marvel, your first writing was a Fantastic Four annual, is that?
Oh no, not before. No, I started out writing Millie the Model.
Millie the Model?
Yeah, actually it wasn't even Millie the Model. She was written in 2 books.
Right.
And the other one, which published a little less often, was called Marvel with Millie. I started with that, but it's just by luck. And so immediately I took over both those books. There was Patsy and Hetty, who still had the last of the Patsy Walker books. So I did a few weeks later, he gave me an Iron Man, Gene Colan's first Iron Man 12-page to write, but he wasn't wild what he did, so he took it back himself. I think he liked Gene's artwork so much too. Then I ended up dialoguing 2 of the last 4 Doctor Strange and the Hitler plotted. But none of these were like a regular assignment. Well, that would have been, except that he took me off to do something else. And the first regular assignment I had, since Doctor Strange got taken away, otherwise I'd have kept doing that, was Sergeant Fury. Which I had no reason to do because I didn't like war comics, but it was still like, it was a little like the Fantastic Four version of the war comic. So I sort of enjoyed it, but it was a job, and it's better than teaching high school.
So what was the first one that you really enjoyed in Marvel?
Well,
that when you knew you were like, okay, now I'm in my groove, now I'm really happy.
I don't think there was any exact moment, because I think I was just, as soon as I was writing any of them, I knew I wanted to go on doing it as long as I could. So it wasn't, you know, there was no chance. I still could have taken that fellowship to the university. For the first few weeks, I still had time to if I wanted to go back to that. I let that expire after a while, and never, that was the end of that. And but there wasn't any moment where I suddenly decided I'm going to do comics for the rest of my life or for 5 years. I've never had a 5-year plan or a 2-year plan or a 1-year plan. I've very much taken life just the way it comes at me. Again, another thing Lennon said, your life is going to happen to you while you're busy making other plans. I'm as much an example as 90% of humanity, but that's true.
It's really cool. My other question that I did have about that whole sort of Marvel period, you became editor-in-chief in 1972.
Yes.
And that went through to 1974.
Yeah. Should be longer, but I got.
Well, that was one of my questions, but I think the first part was more. How did you feel? Because you were assistant editor prior to that, right?
Associate editor. Yeah, but it's the same thing.
Yeah. And so you went from writer to then associate editor to.
Well, I was always doing editorial work from the very beginning. But the titles were a little vague. I was hired to be what they call my original title was staff writer. I was supposed to sit there in the office between 9 and 5 at a little desk right inside the office with the production manager and the secretary and the telephone and where Stan was written out and everything, the artists written out. And I was supposed to sit there and write stories 8 hours a day or 7 hours a day. But I found I couldn't do it. Some people maybe could turn it on. I couldn't do it. Also, it wasn't even just a case of ignoring things. It was that somebody would ask me a question every little bit because I had a lot, compared to them, I had a lot of knowledge.
You knew.
I mean, the thing is, Stan didn't have a great memory, so he didn't remember where Dr. Doom was last time. Instead of trying to look it up, he'd walk in, where did Dr. Doom last appear? What happened to this guy? And Saul Brodsky was the production manager, he was a comic artist himself. And Flo Steinberg, the secretary, they didn't have questions asked because they knew I had a lot of knowledge and so forth. Plus the noise is going on around me. So after a few, 2 or 3 or 4 months of trying to do this with some stuff at home and something, I'd stay late for work, but I wouldn't get paid extra. Finally, Stan just said, look, this staff thing isn't working out. From now on, you just come in and you do whatever kind of work. I guess you'd say editorial work, so you use that term. And you could write anything you write you don't write at your office. I didn't even ever write in my lunch hours. You write at home, weekends, nights, whatever, and you can vouch for freelance, which enables you to kind of double your salary. They don't pay a great salary, but if you get paid extra, you can suddenly double your salary. So the first, my last year as a teacher, 4 years as a teacher, 1964, I made about $5,000, which is equivalent to maybe $50,000. Yeah. My first year in college, and it was only the last half of the year. The first half was still teaching. I jumped to $13,000, which was like $130,000 a year. That's pretty good. Yeah. The first full year there, I made the equivalent of about $180,000 a year. So I spent it all because it's New York, it's expensive. And I'm not very frugal, but I had a good life. I saw every movie in town. I went to Broadway plays. I took 2 a week. I flew back to Missouri once or twice every few months to see my parents or somebody. I took cabs when I felt like it. That's awesome.
We're gonna have to get this really quick. This gentleman, he paid Roy Thomas, right across there. Do you know how to spell that, Roy?
Yeah. There you go.
Still right here. Go ahead, guys.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
No, I know.
That was
There's a few more dollars.
Let me just. We did. This is the longer. I think the longer we did, the better it is for the thing. I did have another question on the mark. So we talked about you being editor and how you got to that point, and not really being the editor role was the editor role.
Sam just kept giving me gradually more and more responsibility. He dealt increasingly. He always dealt with the artists, which I knew I couldn't, but Stan was better with that. And then he was the guy to jump on the sofa and demonstrate what he wanted. And he had me work more with the writers because I sort of brought some of them in the late 60s, Joe Conway and Len Ms Marvel, and people, they already knew how to write comics for them because they worked at DC. So all I had to do was watch them and make sure they were doing Marvel, and they knew what it was. So I didn't really have to do anything, just gradually, generally oversee them and once in a while come in about this and that. But, I just kind of oversaw it and saw which ones were the better, which ones were so good. And they were all good. And all these guys came in, and in the early 70s, guys like Steve Eggard, things like that. I hired my old friend Steve Gerber, from St. Louis, who I know since he was in junior high.
I wanted to ask you, that was another thing I wanted to ask you. Steve Gerber, I read recently, and this may be completely wrong, and please correct me. Howard the Duck.
Yeah.
And
I've heard of him.
You heard of him, right?
Yeah.
So I read that apparently you said to Steve that you thought it shouldn't a cartoon or a cartoon duck or a cartoon animal shouldn't be a horror title, which I thought was a brilliant quote if it was true.
No, I don't remember the exact words, but basically he tossed Howard the Duck as a character
into Man-Thing,
yeah, in the middle of this other dimensional film, drawn by Val Meyer, and he just threw him in there, and I worried about it. Here's the thing, Stan had one time tried to introduce a previous character in the Marvel Universe several years before, when he read that one story, half of it was impossible, Fantastic Four number 12. And the readers, they said so many bad letters about that impossible story that for the next 10 or so years, Stan would not let Howard to try to use him in the story and say, no, the readers hate it, you can't use it. And what I was worried about is, are the readers going to react the same way to Howard the Duck as they did to the Impossible Man, and they'll take it out in a book, So I told Steve, that, look, great character, but you got to kill him off.
Get rid of him.
Now, of course, I'm just, I know that anytime you kill off a character, you have him fall off a cliff, and he's not really dead, he can come back anytime. But I didn't want to make it look like we're going to suddenly have this character out, even though I saw what Steve was doing. It's kind of an interesting idea. I very soon began to realize, that people writing in and so forth. So I was going to do a book. This is after I stopped being editor-in-chief. I was doing a book called R, which was kind of a horror humor book. And so I told Steve, why don't you take that Howard the Duck character, do a story of an 8 or 10-page story for R. By that time, although I didn't know it, he had just made arrangements to do him in that Man-Thing Andor. Then Frank Brenner to do the story again. So he didn't need me. But otherwise, I did Evans killing off. And I volunteered to bring him back, but it turned out he didn't need to, but I was a little concerned about it.
It's fascinating. I read that and I was just struck by just because I saw one of the collectors bring up an Adventures into Fear book, and I was going, that's an interesting book because, ultimately, given the history, so it's nice to get that extra context around Stan and the Impossible Man.
Yeah,
I didn't realise
that's
that
the
was...
reason. Yeah,
Oh, wow.
that was the reason in my mind. It was only later in about the middle 70s, which is more than a decade after Fantastic Four #12, that Stan wasn't paying as much attention anymore. I'd been the editor-in-chief by that time, and I'm writing Fantastic Four. Perez had just become the artist. That was more luck. It wasn't because of Perez that I decided to do it. It just turned out Perez was the perfect artist, even better than anybody else could have been. He had done that story. And we worked it out and had a great fun, and enjoyed the added some other little bits. And we had the whole idea of coming into the Marvel office and really did some great stuff with that. I had some of it's a bit, George added a lot of little details and just did all that wonderful job. And it became, just this kind of classic story. And then it was a big hit. Since that time, they could use the Impossible at any time.
Yes.
So it just showed how the world changed. In 1963 or so, when the first Impossible story came out, the readers were just worried about taking things seriously. Taking things seriously bothered them. 10 or so years later, things had kind of grown up enough that they could accept the fact that there was humor, there was this, there was that. So they could accept the Impossible Man, which they could not have done 10 years ago. And the time was right, and I kind of recognized that, and I got it in. Even was lucky enough to have Jack Kirby do the cover.
And that's to be honest, that's the sweet spot for me. It feels like the 70s. And the reason why the channel's called Still Having 35 Cents is when I was a kid, that was my comics in terms of 1978, 79. But I always loved the Bronze Age. That's good to know. And so it's great to see, I think you're right, what ended up happening in the 70s is much more experimental from Marvel.
Well, the reason is Stan had a certain... It wasn't like he had a dream and he knew what Marvel was going to do. He kind of evolved it and playing by the Steve's fans. He had Jack and Steve, later Ramita, and just able to work with wonderful, talented artists. Yes. And the rest was came in his own. Stan was the guy who liked there, and these wonderful artists as inspiration. Jack especially more than anybody. And even after he was gone, Jack was still like still the bar.
Still standing there, yeah.
You couldn't get away from it. And you didn't want to get away from it.
No.
It was so wonderful. But the thing is that Stan, it wasn't like he was limited because he wanted to do other genres, horror, and he was open to almost anything. But I think I had more of a fire to do other genres, which is funny because I'm probably more. Stan would not have been a comic book fan. He wasn't really a superhero fan. He just did whatever the market wanted. And that was superheroes, and he was great at it. I was different. I was actually more a superhero fan than I was of much anything else. I was mad and COVID. In comics, I was primarily a superhero. And yet, as much as Stan or more, I wanted to see Marvel branch out so that it wasn't so really dependent on superheroes. So when Stan wanted to do horror comics, I was there, but I was also pushing for science fiction and wanted to do anything. He suggested the sword and sorcery stuff. He didn't really know much about it. He knew I did. So I told him we both were working on the kung fu idea. We both like that. And we were kind of in sync, and once in a while I had some genre we hadn't thought of, science fiction. We were kind of superheroes. We got some good stuff out. Even Star Wars.
Was that? No, that's
and and as a result, Marvel was able to expand and get off into a lot of fields. We had a number of good years for monster heroes like Werewolf by Night.
Some of my favorites.
And they were comics. I never really read horror comics as a kid, and I had very little interest when they tried to bring back the horror comics of Marvel without characters. What I really liked is with the characters. I liked creating Morbius. Or Werewolf by Night. I did the first Dracula comic coming up with characters. Well, my friend Gary started Ghost Rider, and we went that together. And there was Son of Satan. There was an idea of Stan in that there was Voodoo, there was Zombie, which is nothing but a name Stan gave me, and I found the story. But it was fun to do that. I didn't want to write that stuff myself, but I loved coming up with it, but I knew it would be a good thing for the comics.
So we're just out of time, unfortunately. But it's been
We're only up to 1972.
I know. I wish I had more time. I'd love to catch. If we ever get a chance, I'd love to catch up with you guys. It's been an absolute pleasure.
We can talk about them doing it on Sunday. Get back in.
Oh yeah, I'd love to. But we'll see. But maybe when you're back in the US, have some time.
Anytime, working out with John. We have his email. He handles all that stuff.
Thank you, sir. It's been an absolute pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your time in Australia.
Yeah, it's great. I always liked it. I liked it when I was here 23 years ago, and I'm glad to have a chance to come back. Another 23 years, maybe I'll do it again.
Thank you, sir. It's been a joy. I will see you soon. And thanks, everyone.
Good luck with your channel.
Thank you, sir.
So that's it. I really hope you enjoyed this opportunity to chat with Roy. And as you can see from the video, we'll try to continue our conversation at a future date and cover more adventures from his days at Marvel in the Bronze Age. And with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you very soon. Don't forget to check out our other great videos, as well as our weekly live stream, the Merry Monday Mail Call Show, every Monday at 7:30 AM Australian Eastern, as well as follow us on Instagram, Facebook and X at Still Only 35 Cents. Enough said.